Why would the public trust government to do more when we can't even competently do the things that we've been assigned to do? Government needs to prove that it is a capable institution before we can expect people to want to empower government to do things beyond its current mandate.
Okay, well, hello out there in podcast land. This is the Liberal Patriot Podcast with your host, Rui Teixeira. I bring you the very finest heterodox conversation and analysis with the most interesting and stimulating guests. We do this every couple of weeks. And today we're happy to have Marc Dunkelman. Now, Marc is a fellow at Brown University's Watson Institute for International Public Affairs. He's been a fellow at NYU's Marin Institute of Urban Management and also at the Clinton Foundation. He's worked on the Hill for the Senate Judiciary Committee and Ledge Director and Chief of Staff to a House Representative. Who was that, Marc?
It was Anthony Weiner.
Oh, okay. All right. So he's been there, done that. And he was Vice President for Strategy and Communications at the Democratic Leadership Council back in the day. Did we overlap at all, Marc? You know that I was briefly there.
No, I don't think so. I was there, I bet you, after. When were you there?
I was like 93, 94, something like that.
Yeah, I'm a generation beyond. So
yeah,
no.
yeah. Well, they disappeared sometime in the 2000s, but yeah, okay.
That's right.
So we have that connection. Now, your work has appeared in the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, many other places, and recently you've had some great stuff in the Washington Post, Politico, and particularly the Atlantic. Now, these all come from Marc's brand new and excellent book, Why Nothing Works, Who Killed Progress and How to Bring It Back. And that's really mostly what we'll be talking about today. I know you've probably done quite a few podcasts by now, Marc. We'll try to keep it fresh as best we can. And I do recommend the book. I do think it's well worth everybody's read. It can be read fruitfully in conjunction with the new book by Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson, Abundance, which we may wind up connecting to in one way or another. But I think this is the conversation that everybody needs to have, and this is one of the essential books for that conversation. Now, Marc, your book came out basically at the same time as Abundance, and it was part of a general conversation that I think is kicking off now about democratic governance failures and inability to get things done. So, what's your take? I mean, I know this is like where you have to give your 1 or 2 minute pitch, but it's inevitable because not everybody here may know about the book yet. So tell us about it. What's your take on how the Democrats, in particular progressives, got into this pickle? What's that all about?
So I think that from the very beginning, progressivism has been a strange marriage of two competing impulses, and most of us have failed to recognize the two impulses or the degree to which they war with one another inside our own hearts and minds. We see in some cases, like in the world of climate change, a problem that we none of us individually can solve on our own. And so in the face of this scourge, we want to empower some bureaucracy to tell the carbon emitters to stop, right? That's pushing power where it exists and pushing it up into some public institution that will do something good for the public. Mm-hmm. We are simultaneously driven by a desire to see big, powerful institutions as a scourge themselves, that they are stealing the autonomy of individual people, that they are oppressing us, that they are settler colonialists. And so in the case of, for example, reproductive rights, we don't want some powerful bureaucrat telling women what to do with their bodies. So we want to push power down. So we have this simultaneous desire to push power up, which I call a Hamiltonian impulse, in sort of the spirit of Alexander Hamilton trying to empower centralized institutions during the post-colonial era, and an effort to a Jeffersonian impulse to push power down to the yeoman farmer, as Thomas Jefferson wanted to do. And that from the very beginning of progressivism, which is sort of dates to the late 1800s, early 1900s, that we have had these two impulses in a sort of a yin and yang dichotomy, from the very beginning, that for the first 70 or 80 years of the movement until the 1960s and 70s, the Hamiltonian impulse largely prevailed. We were the ones that were building big institutions like the Social Security Administration and the Works Progress Administration and the Federal Reserve and the Tennessee Valley Authority and the Marshall Plan. Like, that was our thing to build up the establishment. And then something happened in the 50s, 60s, and 70s where we alighted on the fact that the establishment was actually bad. They were doing bad things, and that our solution to that problem was Jeffersonian. It was to take power that these centralized institutions once wielded and to return them to ordinary people so that they could be protected from the scourge of whatever it was, the urban renewal or the highway that was going to run through their little neighborhood of the town.
Yeah. Talk about that, because I think you talk a lot about Robert Moses at the beginning of your book. And that may not be a story everybody knows about. And I thought it's fascinating because it does encapsulate a lot of the change from one era to the other, the sort of the fate of Robert Moses-ism, both in terms of its there was both a dark and a light side, right, to Moses.
Well, yeah. The book started more than a decade ago when I was working for the Clinton Foundation and commuting into New York on the train. And at one point, I was reading The Power Broker, which is Robert Caro's 1974 won the Pulitzer Prize in 1975 for this book, The Power Broker, which was a expose of Robert Moses, who'd been the most powerful man in New York from the 1930s to the 1960s and had reshaped the physical landscape of the city and the region almost sort of single-handedly. He'd built all these expressways and parkways. He'd built huge housing projects. He'd built parks like Jones Beach. He'd built Lincoln Center and the UN headquarters on the East River. He'd done just completely remade the city in favor of making it more accessible by cars. And in the most famous story in that book, it's a chapter called 1 Mile. He tells the story of this 1 mile of the Cross Bronx Expressway, which was erected in the 1950s across this vibrant working class neighborhood called East Tremont. It was actually mostly of Jewish families in East Tremont, and everyone was telling Moses to stop. Everyone, including the mayor, was against this project. They wanted him to go through a park rather than through the neighborhood, and Moses just completely turned a deaf ear. And that was the 1950s. When the book comes out in the 1970s, like, the South Bronx is, by most standard definitions, an urban wasteland. Like, there are these famous pictures of Jimmy Carter walking through the arsoned rubble of the area, most people blamed Moses for that, like that this highway had really done this terrible damage. So I was reading that story while commuting into Penn Station, which had once been beautiful, was beautiful until the 1960s, until it was destroyed and replaced by Madison Square Garden, so that the station itself was just a warren of hallways below.
Right, yeah. Was that Moses' idea to do that, or how did that happen, the Madison Square Garden thing?
I mean, it was not Moses' idea. Moses, it was sort of on the periphery of that project. He had more interest in the nearby bus station, and it certainly is not a major focus of Caro's biography. That was a case where, in large part, because people like Moses had believed that cars and internal combustion engine vehicles were the future and the trains were the past, they had invested in highways so that people were no longer taking trains, and that drove, like, that mentality drove the big railroads, which had been the big behemoth powers in the early 20th century, into bankruptcy. And so the effort to demolish the old beautiful Penn Station and replace it with Madison Square Garden was a last-ditch effort to breathe life into private railroad corporations that failed.
Interesting. Okay.
In any case, Daniel Patrick Moynihan's sort of abiding goal, like maybe the sort of the central premise of his senatorial career for many years, was to rebuild a Penn Station that befit the world's financial capital. He had shined shoes on the steps of the old Penn Station as a boy, and he imagined reincarnating the old station, which, truth be told, is the front door to the world's financial capital. More people go through Penn Station every day than go through LaGuardia, Kennedy, and Newark combined. Like it's the second most heavily trafficked transit hub in the world after a station in Tokyo. And so this was a worthy goal, but for 20 years, Moynihan, who at the time was chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, he was an incredibly powerful figure, couldn't get the project done. And I'm sitting here reading about Robert Moses doing the Cross Bronx Expressway as everyone's screaming no, and then thinking about Daniel Patrick Moynihan, who has a project that everyone supports but can't get it done. And I'm thinking to myself, what has changed? Like, what happened between then and now? And at the time, I made this observation in 2012, 2013. I didn't know the answer.
Right.
I didn't know what had happened, and so this book is eventually sort of my answer to that mystery.
Right. Yeah, I mean, there's a quote in your book from somebody who said if Robert Moses was reincarnated today, he couldn't do shit. And that has to do with how the sort of legal and other structural obstacles that have basically sort of given almost a massive veto power to procedural requirements. It just makes it super hard to get things done. So we went from this Hamiltonian era where you could get stuff done, albeit sometimes things that shouldn't have been done, to this new Jeffersonian era. So kind of walk us through the steps that took us into our current Jeffersonian era. How did this come about? And was it, I think you basically argue it was well motivated at the time, but it's kind of like once the train had left the station, to go back to trains, nobody knew how to slow it down, bring it back. And here we are.
Well, it is a sort of remarkable moment where the generation that lived through the Great Depression and the Second World War emerged from those catastrophes with a profound respect and reverence for what would become to be known as the establishment. Like the sort of notion that you can't fight City Hall, that's not about not being able to defeat an incumbent mayor. It was this notion that in sort of the background of every city and every institution were the real powers that be, and that they were wise and generally well-intentioned. And like that generation sort of believed that, George Marshall and George Patton and Bradley and like all the the people who had run the alphabet soup of programs in the New Deal, like they were experienced, scientifically minded, rigorous, well-intentioned, and that we should put faith in them to improve the schools and build the infrastructure and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Like that was their cultural mentality. The zeitgeist of that moment was trust the establishment, and the establishment ruled. And then you get to the late 50s, and C. Wright Mills writes The Power Elite, and then you've got you've got the Beat Poets and the New Left and the Port Huron Statement, and a new generation, largely of the boomers. They are newly very skeptical, if not cynical, about the establishment, and see, in many cases, evidence that the old establishment is actually doing us real damage. And through the 60s, like there are all these bits of evidence that critique is on point, right? Rachel Carson comes out with Silent Spring. Ralph Nader comes out with Unsafe at Any Speed. We've got Robert McNamara taking us into a war and clearly they didn't know what they were doing, or they did know what they were doing and they were hiding it from everyone. We're dealing with the repercussions of urban renewal, which had been a Truman administration policy to knock down whole blocks of neighborhoods in the hopes that someone would come and redevelop it with a big, fancy glass tower with more housing, and often the rubble just sat untreated because the money was in building the suburbs, not in rebuilding cities. That Kennedy had doubled down on that. And the whole notion that the establishment knew what it was doing by the late 60s is sort of completely ruined by incompetence, malfeasance, corruption, and Watergate is just the last sort of the last nail in the coffin. By the point you get to the power broker exposing Robert Moses for all of his malfeasance, comes out literally within months of Richard Nixon's resignation. And so by that point, the cultural zeitgeist had changed. And we go from one in which we are, even progressives, had once venerated the establishment and these Hamiltonian institutions, to one in which they were sort of almost automatically cynical about them.
Yeah,
and so
yeah.
you listen to the rhetoric of the Watergate babies, like when Gary Hart runs at first for Senate in the 1970s. What's interesting is that his rhetoric is wildly different from Senate candidates during the Kennedy era, just a decade earlier. He is there's this sort of notion that at the 1968 Democratic Convention, the people on the inside are Hamiltonians, right? They believe in the establishment, and it's Richard Daley and like the old power brokers, and the people on the outside, Abbie Hoffman and Jerry Rubin and whatnot, are all saying that the establishment is corrupt.
Down with the establishment, man.
Correct, down with the establishment, man. Right, up against the wall, motherfucker, and all of that. And by the time you get to 1974, the zeitgeist outside the convention has come inside, in the sense that Gary Hart, while not looking like Abbie Hoffman, is essentially spouting the same message. And that while Robert Caro, in writing The Power Broker, is not Abbie Hoffman or Jerry Rubin, he is by some measure laundering those ideas, laundering the underlying critique that power is bad and that it needs to be returned to the people inside as sort of an establishment figure. And so the progressive agenda changes at that point. And suddenly, rather than saying, what new bureaucracy can we create to do this great thing, like the Tennessee Valley Authority or the Social Security Administration, the Hamiltonian impulse is not completely gone, but generally the agenda is, how do we put new strictures on government so that government doesn't do the bad things that it had done in the 50s and 60s.
Yeah. No, it's interesting you mentioned the Port Huron statement, which actually I went back and read the other day. And it is striking, it's sort of an urtext of the New Left, right? But it's interesting just how much emphasis there is on participatory democracy, and the idea that, in your terms, you need a Jeffersonian pushing down of power to the people, at all levels. And then if we can get people to participate in democracy, then that will presumably solve the problems, or many problems. Anyway, so interesting. I think, people maybe associate SDS later with this crazy Marxist-Leninist stuff, but the origin story is really about the instantiation of that Jeffersonian impulse among a lot of youth. That the establishment is corrupt and we need to push democracy down to the grassroots as far as possible so we can stop the evildoers.
Yeah, and I do think that it's worth saying at this moment, the old Jeffersonian institutions that seemed to work and that had the discretion to do big projects and that built the Tennessee Valley Authority and that did the highway system, which
you mean Hamiltonian, don't you?
Oh, did I say Jeffersonian? Yes. Yeah. The old Hamiltonian institutions.
Right.
The old Hamiltonian institutions, which the progressives had venerated for all those decades, they were problematic in the same in the sense of how we would talk about them today, right? And the term problematic, they were rife with racism. The Tennessee Valley Authority, which connected all these poor farms in the Upper South to the grid when the utilities wouldn't, they did it through a federal workforce, but a segregated federal workforce, right. The Tennessee Valley workers who were white lived in nicer housing than the Tennessee Valley Authority's workers who were black. There are all sorts of reasons not to celebrate the Hamiltonian institutions that were created generations earlier, and the legitimate criticisms of FDR for not taking on lynching and civil rights early, those are real criticisms. The interesting thing is that by the time you get to the 70s and 80s, the Jeffersonian impulse within the movement makes it so that it's almost impossible for government to serve the very communities that it intends to serve.
Yeah, it's interesting, though, when you think about it, as this Jeffersonian impulse is rising and really hegemonizing, the center left, you still have, and simultaneously people, even as they're they still revere the New Deal, a lot of these people, right? I mean, quintessential Hamiltonianism. I mean, at the same time as they're pushing all this other stuff forward, which is making it impossible to do stuff, nevertheless, they say, oh man, the New Deal was so great, FDR, fantastic. Government could actually government could help solve problems. I mean, that was always a big debate in the last 50 years. You could always point to the New Deal and say, well, look, it did all this great stuff. So it's interesting. And I guess now, in a sense, what your book is about is the contradiction has come to the fore. I mean, you can't really contain something it's about broken. I mean, you can't continue pushing the Jeffersonian approach much past where it is today. You need a sort of market correction almost, where you get back to being able to do stuff in more Hamiltonian ways. Do you think that's a difference between you and Ezra Klein and Derek Thompson? I mean, I've read both of your books. In a way, and I think you might have mentioned this at some point in one of your articles, I mean, in housing, for example, it's basically let's get the regs out of the way and let the market do the rest. They don't really deal with this question of, okay, who's got some authority to make decisions here? How do we handle trade-offs? I mean, Derek and Ezra are very clear, of course, about, we're doing a terrible job handling these trade-offs. There's too many roadblocks. We're not allowing people to make a decision about trade-offs. But then they're maybe a little bit vague about how those trade-offs are actually going to be handled, other than, say, in the housing area. Do you see that as a difference somewhat between you and Klein Thompson?
Well, let me take it in two steps, because you said something really interesting there at the beginning, which is I think that we are all Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian at the same time. Mm-hmm. And I think this is my fear when the book came out was that people would say real progressivism is Jeffersonian. Anyone who's read The Power Broker and says I'm a progressive would say the real scourge for progressivism is the establishment, and we're going to take them down. And anyone who says anything else is a pretender. And that is, well, you're a veteran of the DLC, that anyone who's Hamiltonian is a corporate Democrat, or what did Howard Dean once said, that anyone that he was from the Democratic wing of the
Democratic Party. That's right. Yeah.
That's right. And that this debate would turn on that essential thing, that Hamiltonians were moderate and Jeffersonians were. But the truth is that if you want to do single payer, for example, single payer is a classically Hamiltonian impulse, right? That is taking power that is currently resides with these various insurance companies and pushing them back up into one single bureaucracy. That's a Hamiltonian thing, through and through. And so, I don't think that the Hamiltonian and Jeffersonian dichotomy maps perfectly onto far left and center left. I think all of us who are in the anti-Trump world share these two impulses, and the interesting thing is that we, in all these years, despite Herbert Crowley in the 19 teens saying that progressivism, this may be apocryphal, but he's often associated with this phrase, we're going to achieve Jeffersonian ends by Hamiltonian means. That's sort of he's the founder of the New Republic. Right. Uses this term purportedly, we have not distinguished between the two. I mean, the number of times that I've had conversations about my book and I've brought up these two instincts, and then you see people's faces light up because they think, oh, I do think that, and I think that, and it's never occurred to me that these two things are in conflict. I think there's some solace in knowing, oh, there's a conflict within our own ideology. That is something that we could resolve, and maybe that would make us more effective. We don't just have to light our hair on fire about how terrible Trump is. There are things that we could do to improve the thinking and our own liturgy. Now to your point, you are right that my basic view is that within the abundance agenda, so that it's been titled of late, it seems to me that YIMBYism on the housing front is sort of way ahead of all the other reform movements, and that is because the abundance agenda in that realm largely is Jeffersonian, and Jeffersonian feels right. And I say that what I mean is that right now there are three levels in housing policy. There's the government, which wants more housing. That's at the top. At the bottom, there's the person who owns the lot, who wants to build, maybe a fourplex on a single family zoned lot, and then there's between them the neighborhood, and the neighborhood doesn't want the new development, and power is with the neighborhood, right? And so at that point, if you want to give a green light to more housing, you either need to push power up to the government, which can tell the neighborhood to go, to go packing, or or alternatively, you can empower the person who owns the lot to say, by right, you can build a fourplex on this single family zoned lot. The YIMBY impulse is to return power down to the person that owns the property, to say that by right they can do what they want. If they own the property, they can build a granny flat, they can build something above their garage, they can build a second unit, they can tear down their house or whatever. They can do whatever they want. That feels right to us because it is returning power away from the evil neighborhood groups that are saying don't do it and returning it to the individual. That feels like that is in the same realm as taking the power that is wielded by the bureaucracy that would stop a woman from controlling her own body during a pregnancy and returning it to her. Like that it's the same. Like there is a powerful force above, and we are going to return power down. When you're trying to build a high-speed rail line, or you're trying to build a transmission line from a waterfall that produces clean energy to a city that's going to use that clean energy instead of fossil fuel generated electricity, like there's nobody down below to whom you can return the property. You're building the transmission line over a right of way, over a forest, over a town. Nobody wants that in their backyard. So it's remarkable to me that the element of the abundance agenda that seems to be getting the most traction is in housing, because there's a Jeffersonian solution there that is palatable. If there's any one place where I think that Derek, Ezra, and I may have a slight disagreement, it is that fundamentally my view is that the problem is one of discretion. That the thing that Robert Moses and the establishment had back in the day was that in the end they could choose where the bridge was going to go, where the transmission line was going to go, where the housing was going to be built. Like, they didn't have to listen to anybody, and they could turn a deaf ear to all the objections and just choose. And that to address that problem, progressives created procedure. And the procedure was going to require that all the people who were going to be affected, all the animal species that were going to be affected, all the beautifully preserved homes that were going to be affected.
Snail darter or what have you, yeah.
Yes, right. The orchid the orchid that no one's ever seen. That we're not going to take away Bigfoot's habitat. That all of those people and values, all those valuable commodities, people, individuals, species, buildings, that they should all have a role in the process, and that if we gave everyone a role in the process, we would come to some sort of resolution that satisfied everyone. That was the progressive dream. That was, if you read Port Huron as you just did, participatory democracy presumes that if everyone participates, we will we will come to an ideal solution. And the core, I think the thing that is fundamentally wrong about that is that there's no guarantee that if everyone sits down, that they're eventually going to see the light, that there's going to be some place where you can put the bridge and the pedestal for the bridge, or you can put the wires and the poles for the transmission line in a way that everyone thinks is acceptable. Like, you need someone. We replaced discretion with process, and process, it turns out, doesn't necessarily get you to the result you need. And so what we need is a process that ends with discretion. Right? Like, someone needs to be able to choose. There is going to be a trade-off. someone's house is going to have to be confiscated through eminent domain because the pedestal for the bridge has to go there. Because
Right.
if it doesn't go there, it's going to have to go there, and then that person's house is going to have to be taken by eminent domain. One of these two places is going to have to be taken by eminent domain, and there's nothing you can really do entirely to compensate someone for the
Sure.
upheaval of having their family's home taken. And so you can't give both of those homeowners veto power. You can't give the orchid that it might go extinct because there's a power line through the forest veto power. What you need is a process where all of the proper concerns are taken into account. Everyone has a voice, no one has a veto, and then someone makes a decision. Someone says, you know, the cost to to this endangered species is not worth the benefit of this particular project, but the cost of demolishing a historic building in order to make sure that this number of people can get into the city more expeditiously so that another 100,000 people have commutable access to this downtown or whatever, that is something that a trade-off that I'm willing to make. The problem right now is that progressives have created a system that cannot ratify a trade-off. It cannot it cannot accept the downsides of anything. And so we need a process that allows progressives and for government to do that. Like otherwise, government is essentially rendered completely dysfunctional.
Yeah, well, as a card-carrying Hamiltonian, I'm very sympathetic to that. But how do you do it, I guess? Let's take a concrete example. You talked about in the book, if that's the way people pronounce it, the clean energy hydropower line that, basically still hasn't happened, which obviously seems like a no-brainer from the standpoint of what needs to be done, but doesn't get done because of all the kinds of things you talk about in the book. So maybe tell us a little bit about that particular fiasco and how the mechanics of how that might be remedied by this discretionary authority you're talking about in a hypothetical way.
Yeah. So the core of it is that in the beginning of 2016, Governor Charlie Baker, a Republican from Massachusetts, under pressure to decarbonize the Massachusetts grid, signs a bill that gives broad subsidies to various clean energy projects, some of which are going to be wind turbines erected off the southern coast of Massachusetts. People know something about that in many cases if they live in the Northeast. Less well known is that he wanted to purchase hydropower from Quebec.
Right.
Quebec has erected all of these dams, and they had a surfeit of clean power, but there was no way to get the power from Quebec, which is, of course, across the northern border, down through one of the states in between Massachusetts and the border, into the Massachusetts grid. And so he provides, like, basically the deal is Massachusetts will build this transmission line. It will provide a big, hefty subsidy to any state that allows for the line to be run through them, so that they come out at a profit.
Right.
And the upshot will be that Massachusetts will replace the equivalent of 700,000 cars and their pollutant tailpipes on the streets of Massachusetts every year using this clean power instead. And all they have to do is build, for a few, for $1 billion or so, this one line. I will encourage people to read the book just for this. It's
Right. It's an incredible story.
It's an incredible story of just of local communities being sort of buying into the idea, recognizing it, and then the whole demagoguery that comes in about what the implications will be, and it's going to go across the Appalachian Trail and the Kennebec River Gorge, and there's this one lake that no one's ever seen, but if you place the line too close, then if someone were ever to find this lake and go fishing on it, they might see it early in the morning. It's just an endless stream of objections, and then there's a fight at the state level where they want to do every town should have a referendum, and then they do a statewide referendum about it, and then there's a court case about the referendum because had the company which was building the line already invested enough in the line so that it was the contract was still viable, and you couldn't undermine a contract that the state had entered into. So here we are. It's you and I are talking now in April of 2025. It's been 9 years. There's very little coming out about this project at the moment. I presume that it's being constructed right now, but I don't really know. Mm-hmm. But it's bananas. It's some wire and some poles. Most of it going through an area that had already been cleared, so that it's just a few miles in northern Maine where they needed to, knock down a few trees. And so I mean, how many years of the equivalent of 700,000 polluting cars extra have we had simply because we couldn't get this thing done? And the objections in many cases were again from the left. Right? There is in northern Maine some rare orchid species, and there is a fear that if you had this line come through, like this was one of the many objections that those promoting the line had to address was, what do you do about these orchid species? So I don't have anything about orchids, but anything against orchids, for or against. Like I'm orchid neutral.
Orchids are fine.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. But it just it's laughable that a movement that claims that we're facing a climate catastrophe, the equivalent of an asteroid headed straight towards Earth, is not able to make these trade-offs. Like there's simply, we're not going to get to carbon neutrality. I mean, this is Massachusetts we're talking about. This is Massachusetts. This is the greenest area of the country, right? This is the most left wing, and within our own creed, we're not able to resolve these differences, and that's just one of lots of stories. But it gets to the quote is it's an energy developer who made that quote that if Robert Moses were brought back to life today, he wouldn't be able to get to do shit. Like it's for this exact kind of shenanigans, mishigas, that we can't get it done. Yeah,
the Chinese would have done it in a week, man. We gotta wake up here. I mean, not only I'm not the biggest fan of the asteroid hitting the Earth view of climate change, so I do think it's a significant problem. But I mean, depending whatever your view of climate change is, right? You're not. There's no way progress could go at this rate, and you can do much about it. I mean, come on, are you kidding me? This is doesn't pass the laugh test. I mean, all these elaborate plans to, sort of get at least approach carbon neutrality, at least at some time in the next few decades. All of it will go to, won't happen because it's just too slow. Just too damn slow.
I mean, and just this is a point that I know that Ezra and Derek have gotten some, and that when our books have been reviewed together, this is the criticism that comes from certain communities, certainly the neo-Brandesian concern. Mm-hmm. The notion is that rather than focus on this, we ought to focus on other concerns, or that doing this well, having trade-offs, doing infrastructure and housing and clean energy, and that would somehow take away from our ability to do the things that that Lena Khan and her crowd want to do. My point is if your view is that neoliberalism is bad, and that the problem is that we've given too much power to the markets, and that the government should be doing more in and of itself, well then, if the emblematic example of government competence is that they can't build a goddamn transmission line for clean energy, or they can't build enough housing, or our infrastructure is failing, or that they put out $5 billion in formula funding to build EV chargers around the country in the bipartisan infrastructure
bill. Kind of hard
to
find them these days, yeah.
Right, and they're only 58 built after 3 years. like, why would the public trust government to do more when we can't even competently do the things that we've been assigned to do? Like, government needs to prove that it is a capable institution before we can expect people to want to empower government to do things beyond its current mandate.
Yeah, amen, brother. But to return to this NECEC, if I can use that phrase, the hydropower transmission line thing.
No one seems to use that term. They call it NECs. I don't know what they call it.
So I used it anyway.
Good enough.
You and me know what NECEC is. But anyway,
That's right.
but how do we get this? What constitutes this authority then, right? I mean, I completely buy your idea that, I mean, this is mass insanity to continue with this system. We do need a way of having some discretionary authority to make these decisions once all the input is in. So what would be the mechanics of that, including in a situation like this? Who would make the decision and how would they be appointed? Have you thought about that? I mean, I think that's pretty key, right?
Yeah, I think it would vary from circumstance to circumstance. This is actually sort of my next project by some mechanism, is sort of thinking through, are there elements of the government where we are satisfied that there is some institution that is capable of making trade-offs that we can embrace? You know, I mean, for as long as you and I have been in politics, there have been people of our ilk who've been calling for BRAC commission style government and this and that, right? Where the legislature empowers some blue ribbon commission to do some difficult thing like closing military bases, or people call for a Marshall Plan for X, Y, or Z, and the Marshall Plan, of course, was just a reflection of the Tennessee Valley Authority, which again was like a single guy. David Lilienthal was empowered to extend power across the Upper South, so like these have been ideas that have been bounced around. Are there examples of bureaucracies that properly balance the Jeffersonian and Hamiltonian impulse in a satisfying way? You know, I mean, the irony in the world of energy infrastructure is that gas pipelines, like the pipelines that are used to transport fossil fuels from one place to another, are cited not by states but by the federal government, and like that was in the original legislation passed during the Roosevelt administration. Pipelines are in the federal domain, whereas transmission lines, because the presumption was that coal would be burned locally and then transported to wherever it was going, or oil would be transported to where it was going, burned locally, and then distributed distributed within the locality. The presumption was that should be a state and local concern. So building an interstate transmission line today is much harder than building an interstate pipeline. Like that's, you know, in the age of climate change, that itself is sort of just insanity. And so, like, you could imagine simply switching those two things, or at least giving transmission lines a true federal siting authority that would overcome. And there are efforts, complex. You know, the sort of one of the eye-opening elements of writing this book and working across different sectors, in housing, in transportation and infrastructure, in regulation, in clean energy, is that people in these various realms all believe that they have sort of a singular challenge in facing this law or that law, or this regulatory body or that, or these politics, and they're all basically facing the same core set of challenges, which is that we've gone from a Hamiltonian mindset to one with all these Jeffersonian protections that make it impossible. But they can't even talk. They can't even talk to each other because it's a slightly different set of challenges. Right. But this is by some mechanism exactly the point, is that no one has connected this whole. I think Ezra and Derek have done a great job. I think that Yoni Applebaum in his book Stuck has done a great job in the realm of housing, but connecting these sort of much broader impulses within the progressive creed to the more general challenge.
Well, let's talk about that for a second. I mean, so where are we on getting these ideas into the warp and woof of progressive politics? I mean, there's been a lot of resistance to the Klein-Thompson book and various things that it said, and plus the Democratic Party, the presumed vehicle for these kinds of approaches, is hardly committed at this point in any way to dramatically changing the procedural obstacles in the way of getting things done. It's still a nascent movement. How much progress do you think is being made? And is there anyone out there who you feel, sort of a reasonably well-known politician who kind of gets this? Where are we on this? Or are we just still in the realm of, and when I interviewed Derek Thompson, he kind of put it this way, we're still in the realm of, sort of trying to get the ideas out there. I mean, there's not really much of a movement to it aside from being an intellectual movement and not much political clout to it yet because it's really taken it up. Because it's difficult within the context of today's Democratic Party.
And I've heard Derek say that he imagines this is the movement. I'm a little skeptical. That it rises to the level of, the environmental movement of the 1970s or the civil rights movement of the 1960s.
Definitely not.
But that's not exactly how ideas in the world of politics always move around. Like this is an idea that I find. I have rarely met a progressive who heard the Jeffersonian Hamiltonian dichotomy for the first time and thought, "Oh, this is bullshit." Right? Like almost everyone recognizes within their heart and mind that they have these two impulses, and it helps them. It's just a different frame to understand the challenges before us. I do think, just the degree to which Josh Shapiro is now being celebrated for rebuilding that section of 95 that collapsed quickly, or Jared Polis is being, lauded for his effective government in Colorado, or Rahm Emanuel is coming back on the scene, or, I did an event with Gina Raimondo. I mean, she certainly tapped into this. Pete Buttigieg, mentioned both Derek Thompson and Ezra Klein book and my book in a speech at Harvard. Like I do think that there is sort of an emerging notion that this is a problem. It's interesting to me that the most worrisome element of this becoming more and more part of the Democratic creed and sort of at the forefront of our minds is just the degree to which Trump really fails. Right? If this guy proves to be disaster, I mean, it appears that he's, taking the economy down root and branch.
Yeah, it's not looking good right now. I think that's safe to say.
Correct. Like if this guy's going to stub his toe so dramatically that everyone feels the pain, it's going to give us an excuse not to do the hard work of grappling with these challenges.
Exactly. I was going to raise exactly this issue with you because I've been thinking about it just today. I mean, it does appear like, this is a proverbial clusterfuck on the part of the Trump administration. And this gives Democrats something they're very comfortable doing, denouncing Trump and all his crazy excesses. And, therefore, what is the need to change anything, really? I mean, do we really need to rethink our approach to permitting and regulations? We need, the issue of the procedural blocks to doing. I mean, why bother? I mean, we'll be able to get back in, right, just by denouncing Trump and how crazy he is. So in an odd sort of way, I think it's a bit of a problem for, what we might loosely call this abundance movement and for this reform movement, that people are more inclined to listen to doing something really different when they feel like they've really been, they're really behind the eight ball. They've got to do something different and do it pretty soon. And now, because of the mishigas of the Trump administration, it's kind of like a get out of jail free card. Ah, great. We don't have to do anything different. Fantastic. It's back to business as usual.
I mean, this is something that I regret about myself during the last campaign, was that I remember reading these articles that both Trump and the Democrats wanted the election to be about Trump. So it would be about Trump. And we figured that the hangover from the January 6th and his lousy handling of the pandemic and the chaos of the first Trump administration and whatnot, that these things would compel people into our camp almost naturally, that we could rely on that, that the more the more Trump was the focus of everyone's ire, the better we would do. And I'm not a numbers guy per se. I didn't look at the poll. I wasn't interpreting the results or watching watching focus groups. I presumed that the experts knew. And
big mistake.
but that was a big mistake on my part.
Yeah.
It was also a mistake, like it made it so that when this incredible Atlantic story came out about Pete Hegseth, texting war plans to Jeffrey Goldberg at the Atlantic, and everyone, it seemed to me, in the progressive thoughtosphere was like, all right, well, this is a great gift to us.
We
and I
got him
began
now.
thinking to myself,
We got him now.
yeah, like how many times have we had this feeling right after the rally at Madison Square Garden before the election? We thought we'd won back the Hispanic vote.
Oh, that was I knew that was crazy. Yeah.
And like here, the sort of the presumption that the way that they're dealing with classified information is going to necessarily drive military families who know that if they shared information like that over Signal, that they would be, put away and dishonorably discharged, etc. I don't know that that's not true, but I'm certainly not convinced that it is. And this feels to me like a real thing to me, right? That the notion that government doesn't work, that we are advocates for the most infuriating experience you'd ever have at the Department of Motor Vehicles. Right? You can sort of imagine yourself going in and bringing in all the paperwork, and they say, no, you need four pieces of paper proving that you live at that address, not 3, and now you have to go home and you've missed your appointment, and there's not another appointment for 3 months, and now you can, right? Like the sort of notion that there's someone with a lanyard and short-sleeved collared shirt who really doesn't want to help you. That we have become the advocates for that style of government, and that you see that in the way that government doesn't work to build housing, that it doesn't work to build good infrastructure, that it doesn't work to take advantage of the clean energy revolution. And that if we sit here remaining focused on Trump, complaining about him, and not dealing with this core issue of the fact that government doesn't work, we will never get past the sort of just enough to beat him on the margins. Vote. And that's like that this guy shouldn't be hard to beat, and he is, because we're defeating ourselves.
Mark, I couldn't agree with that more. You were singing my song there, and I think you and I and others have to keep singing that song because, by God, that's really the way forward. We don't just want to beat Trump by a little bit. We don't just want to get him out and get someone else back in after we screw up. I mean, we want to be a really plausible, strong alternative that really delivers when we manage to push Trump and the Republicans aside or whatever. That's the real key to a new, a real golden era, not Trump's golden era, but our golden era, right? So I just couldn't agree with you more. And I do hope everyone out there reads your book because it's examples, and I think your basic argument is extremely sound. So with that, I think I want to thank you for being on the Liberal Patriot podcast. And if you're ever in Washington, come on by AEI and I'll buy you lunch.
Sounds great. Thank you for having me.